Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. I see that most of you have also attended my first two lectures. I trust they've been worthwhile for you. I will be changing the subject today. Earlier this week, in the first two lectures, I've drawn in my remarks from books I've written previously, essays I've written. Today, I will be drawing from my forthcoming new book, Democracy for a Sustainable World, The Path from the Pnyx, which will be published in May by Cambridge University Press. As mentioned, it's not about trade. This new book is about the relationship I see between democracy and sustainable development. And it's about how I believe we can make the phrase democratic global governance something other than what it is now, which is an oxymoron. Indeed, I believe we can achieve democratic global governance at every level of governance. I said both yesterday and the day before that I believe we have a duty of optimism in setting out for you the agenda that I believe the WTO should and could be pursuing now. In my lecture yesterday, I believe I demonstrated that I am an optimist. Today, my optimism will be on full display in the proposals that I am making in my new book. If we look around us, then we, at first glance, don't see reason for optimism. We see reason aplenty for pessimism. Recently, the negotiators on biodiversity at their conference of parties in Colombia made some progress, but they were unable to do what most needs to be done, which is provide abundant financing to preserve nature, protect nature and us from further biodiversity loss. As I speak today, climate negotiators are assembling in Baku. What are we likely to get there? Yesterday, the chairman of the conference, the host, suggested that we need to double down on oil and gas production. This is not quite what you would expect of someone hosting a climate conference which is devoted above all to trying to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. The Security Council of the United Nations has failed in its efforts thus far to end conflict in Ukraine following the Russian aggression there. I could go on. There is evidence aplenty that would seem to give us cause for not being too optimistic. Add to this what seems to be a global retreat from democracy and the liberalism that is required to make democracy work as it should. If one looks at the annual Freedom House reports or other assessments of where we stand on democracy worldwide, and one sees that most of the people in the world do not live in democracies. Nearly half live in authoritarian regimes. Among those people who supposedly live in democracies, many of them live in countries that are democratic in name only. And for the most part, in representative democracies, we see what political theorists describe as thin democracy. A thin democracy is one in which democracy consists mainly of voting every now and then, and perhaps maybe showing up for jury duty. The United States of America, I'm proud to say, is still a democracy, but in my view, it is a thin democracy. What is the relationship between democracy and sustainable development? Sustainable development being a goal that every member of the United States, every member of the United Nations has embraced in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, including the United States of America. Here, let me read an excerpt from the introduction to my new book. It is through the human development that results from sustainable development that we as individuals can become more capable of governing ourselves in a democracy, and thus of making democracy work. And it is through the institution and the practice of democracy that we as humanity can find the will and the way to pursue and accomplish the societal transformations needed to achieve sustainable development. Free and open societies in which all citizens have an equal opportunity to participate, support the creativity and innovation that are needed for problem solving in a world too full of the problems posed by the multiplicity of obstacles to sustainable development. And freedom and openness feed the optimism that is indispensable to summoning the will to solve these problems and overcome these obstacles. This, as I see it, is the relationship between democracy and sustainable development. Thus, in my view, democracy is not possible without sustainable development, and sustainable development is not possible without democracy. In addition to our failures of international cooperation at a time when international cooperation is urgently needed and needed more than ever before, we are seeing the basis for effective governance democratically crumble in different parts of the world. We are seeing authoritarianism on the rise. Why is that? In my view, this retreat from democracy and increasingly also from liberal values in democratic countries can be traced mostly to an increasing hopelessness about the future, even a fear about the future, an apprehension about what comes next. We live more than ever in a time of uncertainty, and increasingly individuals find that they feel that they are on their own. Furthermore, they don't trust those that once, in many places, where democracy succeeded, they trusted before. There is a pervasive failure of trust in the democratic countries of the world. Indeed, there's less and less trust of governance in countries that are not democratic. I can assure you from my visits there that the people of China trust their one-party government less than they did a generation ago. This is part of the explanation for recent events in my own country, and I think the United States is only one of the many places in the world where we see this lack of trust. As a consequence, people don't know where to turn. They no longer trust the so-called elites. They don't trust their elected officials. They don't trust the scientists. They don't trust the experts of all kinds. They don't trust institutions. Least of all do they trust international institutions, which of course have a democratic deficit. Institutions internationally have a legitimacy that comes only from their member states that have formed them. And when so many of those member states are not democratic, and indeed are authoritarian in some fashion, then how legitimate is that? How do we remedy this? How do we restore trust where it once existed? How do we make it where it has never been? To me, the remedy is participation. I believe what's missing in governance, what's missing in what we call democratic governance, is participation. Instead of having thin democracies, we should construct strong democracies in which participation is not simply a matter of voting every now and then, but in which democratic participation is a way of life. And to achieve this, I think we need to change the structures of democracy. Thank you, Amanda. Where do we go to find ideas about how the structures of democracy ought to be changed? I was trained as an historian in addition to being trained in law. So I tend to look to history, and to answer this question, I look to ancient history. I look to ancient Athens. I look to the first democracy, which was established in 508 BC, when a man who surprisingly has been forgotten by history, a renegade aristocrat named Cleisthenes, linked arms with the common people of Athens and created a new form of self-rule. It was there that we see, in retrospect, the first kind of governance that we can recognize as being democracy. Let me emphasize, this was a democracy with quite a few faults. There were about 250,000 people in the Athenian city-state, which comprised an area called Attica, about the size of the American state of Rhode Island, but only a minority of them were citizens who were permitted to participate in this new kind of government called democracy. About half of them were slaves. About half of them were women. There were also many thousands of migrants. None of the slaves or the women or the migrants were permitted to be citizens. Citizens were only those men who were 18 years or older. But for them, the democracy they shared was the purest and most direct democracy the world has ever seen. Because the citizens of Athens at that time actually ruled themselves through what the political theorists describe as a direct democracy. They did not elect a president. They did not elect representatives to speak on their behalf. They spoke on their own behalf. They assembled at least 40 times a year on a hillside just across from the Acropolis in Athens called the Pnyx, hence the subtitle of my book. And 6,000 strong, first come, first serve in terms of arriving for the assembly. They made all the major decisions of the city-state by majority vote, directly. And then to administer the city-state, except in a very few instances, such as the generals who led the army and the treasurer who kept the city-state's gold and silver and other valuable metals. They chose every other administrative post by lot, by random selection, by what is called sortition. Indeed, the classicists today, looking back, have concluded that perhaps as many of a third of all the citizens of Athens at some point in their lives held a responsible administrative role in the governance of the city-state. They would serve for a year. They would only be allowed to serve twice for 1 year in their lifetimes. There were hundreds of positions. The 10-member administrative board that was in charge of roads and bridges, the 10-member administrative board that was in charge of weights and measures. All the things that we in our thin democracies today create governmental departments to do were all governed through people who were chosen by random selection once a year. And what the Athenians built was, in our modern thinking, something that could be described as a system. It was a network, an interlocking network that together developed among hundreds of city-states that all shared the Greek culture. By far the one that is remembered most and that accomplished most economically, culturally, and otherwise at the time. This was done through direct democracy. It was done through a fully participatory democracy. And what I believe we need today is a fully participatory democracy. I think it's only through being able to participate in their own governance. It is only by true self-rule in strong and living democracies that the people today in the world who feel like they've been left over, left out, and left behind will find hope, find confidence, and be able to find a renewed mutual trust that will enable them to make democracy work, and that will enable them to do what needs to be done to achieve sustainable development. And as I said earlier, it's in achieving the human development that comes from sustainable development that we develop the capability to make democracy work. And it's through the participatory kinds of democracy that enable us to find the right ways to do what must be done by solving problems and producing results that we can achieve sustainable development. How would I do this? In their random selection, the Athenians used an early ancient machine called a kleroterion. If you want to look it up online, it's Kleroterion. If you happen to go to Athens and to the Agora and to the museum there, you can see one of these machines, an ancient kleroterion. And these were the machines that they used to randomly select the Athenian citizens who participated in their jury courts, who served on their administrative boards, who made Athens and the democratic system and network of Athens work, and work successfully. The good news for us is that we don't need a kleroterion, because unlike the ancient Athenians, we know about scientific random sampling. I'm sure you've had statistics in basic mathematics, and so you understand that scientific sampling can produce a representative sample that is reflective of the diversity of the population that is sampled. When Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington, John Adams, and others among the founders of my country decided to create the United States of America, one of their great fears was that the country was so large and the population was so large that they would not be able to sustain a democracy. Part of the reason that they created a representative democracy, if you read James Madison, one of the other founders, is that it was a substitute, a second best substitute for having the direct democracy that Athens had. Representative democracy, it was thought, was necessary because of the large size of the American population. There was simply no way, in their view, that there could be direct democracy except possibly in the proverbial New England town meetings, some of which still occur. But they didn't know about scientific sampling. We know, all these years later, that in scientific sampling, in making certain that it is representative and reflects the diverse composition of a population, it is not the size of the population. that matters. It is the size of the sample. The larger the sample, so long as it's random, the less the margin of error in terms of being representative. Thus, it's possible to have a sample of a certain size that would reflect representatively 1,000 people, but also 1 million people. And scientific sampling makes it possible for us to use sortition on a global basis, which is precisely what I propose. I believe that the best democracy, the most effective democracy, the one that can achieve sustainable development, the one that can be improved in turn by sustainable development, the one that can restore trust, is a democracy that combines the best of individual wisdom with the best of collective wisdom. I would keep representation, but I would improve it. In my own country, I would do away with the power of money to influence elections. I would do away with the distortions of electoral districts. I would do away in our presidential elections with the electoral college. I would create real representation based on the merits of those who stand for election, so that those representatives would not only heed the people, but would also have the courage truly to lead them. But I do not believe that merely having right representation is enough. I would also add to this collective wisdom. Collective wisdom comes from the use of sortition. If one looks at Condorcet's jury theorem, which he devised while he was imprisoned by Robespierre and the terrorists during the French Revolution before his tragic death. And if one looks all the way back to Aristotle in his Politics, in which he first said that the wisdom of the crowd can be greater than the wisdom of any one person in it, then one sees the potential for collective wisdom. And collective wisdom can be derived by the use of random selection. Now you may say, if we use random selection, we could get people in positions of decision-making authority who are totally unqualified to exercise that authority. But think about it. Either we believe that people are capable of governing themselves or we do not. Either we believe in democracy or we do not. Those who say that people are capable of electing their representatives, but they are not capable of governing themselves, are what I call half Democrats. They are only partly democratic. If one individual is not expert sufficiently to be capable of governing themselves, the answer is not to prevent people from governing themselves. The answer is to make certain that citizens are indeed capable of exercising decision-making power. In other words, don't take away democracy, instill more democracy, and make it work. My proposals are novel, but my ideas are not. My ideas build on Immanuel Kant, on the great German-American thinker Hannah Arendt, on the American philosopher John Dewey, and on two of Dewey's followers, now departed, who were both friends of mine, Benjamin Barger and Frank Anderson. They all believed in a living democracy that meant more than just voting and complaining in between votes. What would I do? First of all, I would begin working to instill structures of both right representation and sortition at every level of governance worldwide. Where there are democracies, I would add to the institutions of representation, institutions of sortition that would share equally in decision-making. Where there are not democracies or only nominal democracies, I would work to instill democracy and shape it in ways that would combine both right representation and sortition. And where there is no democracy, where there is only authoritarianism, I would fight for democracy and then try to make it work. How would I restructure these democratic institutions at every level? I would do so in much the same way, which I describe at length in the book, but I'll only outline now. The right representation I've already described. I would keep, for example, the General Assembly of the United Nations, and I would keep the Council of Delegates to the WTO. These all represent nation states, for better or worse. They're all artifacts of the ongoing Westphalian system of international law and practice that builds all international governance on the basis of nation states. I believe we need to depart from that by beginning to create institutions that do not represent nation states, but rather represent our common humanity. So, for example, with the United Nations, I would create a participatory assembly. Unlike some reformers, I would not have people elected by nation states then to become delegates in a new popular assembly in the United Nations. I would not recreate in the United Nations the European Parliament or the United States House of Representatives. Instead, I would go completely around the nation states. I would ask for volunteers from all over the world and do all I could to encourage the United Nations to seek out volunteers. The United Nations engaged in quite a successful effort in developing the Sustainable Development Goals by seeking out several million people from around the world who participated in some fashion in that effort. What we need instead are several billion. I would only have volunteers. I would give nation states absolutely no authority to engage in this process in any way. And if nation states posed obstacles to it, I would deny to them the benefits of their participation in any institution that sought to engage in this global sortition, but was prevented from doing so by that nation state. In other words, if one country decided they weren't going to agree to allow a sampling of their population, I would deny that country any privileges they currently have in being a member of the United Nations, including serving on the Security Council, which itself needs to be reformed. And I would not just do this in the United Nations, I would do it in every single international institution. In the international institution with which I'm most familiar, I would also have what I call a circle of participation, randomly chosen from throughout the world. I have suggested that these circles of participation would consist of 151 members each. Why that? If you look at your sociology and psychology and political theory, then you'll be acquainted with something called Dunbar's number. It's a British theorist named Dunbar who's concluded after some study that the ideal number of people to have in a group is about 150, because he has demonstrated empirically that that's the maximum number of people that any average person can know and work with on an ongoing basis. I would make the number 151 because that way you could have a majority vote. So in the WTO, as in other international institutions, whether it's United Nations Environment Program, whether it's UNESCO, whatever it may be, or in multilateral environmental arrangements, other international fora, I would convene these circles of participation and I would give them equal decision-making power with the current councils of delegates. In other words, it would take an affirmative decision by both the current group of representatives from their countries and also the randomly chosen circle of participation to approve an action. I'm sure this will be immediately popular in Geneva. And as I said, I would do this everywhere, in all institutions. With some of them, they might want to choose from among volunteers who've expressed an interest in their particular line of endeavor. People have expressed an interest in environmental issues, for example, might volunteer for the circle of participation for the United Nations Environment Program or the United Nations Development Program. But I would not simply have these circles of participation. I would also have two additional kinds of circles randomly chosen, again from volunteers, and in some institutions from volunteers who have a particular interest in particular areas. I would have circles for nature. In my book, I speak at length about our failure to see as a species that we are simply one among many other species who share this planet. And our failure as a species to see that ours is a part of the planet. We are not separate from nature. We're a part of it. You have only to look at the latest news on your smartphone to see the truth of what I've just said. But we're only slowly coming to that realization as a species. We are animals. We are one among many species, alas, a declining number. And all that lives on this planet depends on all the rest of nature within this fragile biosphere of ours. So I would have circles for nature that would advise these decision makers, these delegates engaged in right representation, and these circles of participation chosen by random selection on their decisions to make certain that they remember the centrality of nature. I would also have circles for the future. These also would be randomly chosen from volunteers, and I suggested that the members of these circles should be between the ages of 12 and 21. If you don't believe that teenagers have something to say about the future, then you haven't been paying attention lately. In many ways, they're far ahead of the rest of us. And I have every confidence that they are fully capable of reminding us of our need to, as we say in sustainable development, give priority to intergenerational equity. We need to look, each of us, at our self-interest in a new and different way. We need to consider our principle of interest rightly understood, as Tocqueville put it nearly 200 years ago. We need to look broadly to our interest, which would include everyone else in humanity and all of nature, and we need to look over the long term, which would include our future. Now, before I entertain questions about how we might achieve any of this, let me make a few final points. Again, this is all about trust and the lack of trust in our current circumstances. Why do I think that participation will create trust? I have had the privilege in my life, a life in which I began to engage in public actions at the age of 13, to serve in positions of significant responsibility, administratively, executively, judicially, legislatively, at every level of governance. And in my experience, people are much more inclined to trust what they have had a say in making. In addition to participation, there must be a deliberation that enables everyone who's participating to have their say. If you ask me, what is the moral justification for democracy? I would tell you it is that every human being is equal in human dignity and therefore has an equal claim to an equal say in every decision that may affect them. I would argue also that there is an abundance of evidence, and I set it out in the book, that not only is there this moral argument for democracy, but there's an argument of practical utility for democracy. When democracy is employed, invariably the results are better than when it's not, in terms of improving lives and prosperity and overall well-being. Authoritarianism simply does not produce those results. Authoritarians may achieve what they set out to achieve, but none of them are interested in achieving the full human flourishing of their people, which is the rightful goal of democracy. We need the right leaders. We need leaders who will stand up and tell us what we need to hear and not what we just want to hear at any given time. People who will truly lead us and not appease us by appealing to our fears and apprehensions. We need the right type of interaction, of course, among these institutions once they're created. Just as the ancient Athenians had a democratic network, all these circles of participation for all these institutions at every level must be interconnected through rules and through procedures and other practices that will produce a just outcome. The last point I want to make is that if we want to create this type of living democracy, if we want to create systems of governance that will actually work to achieve the goals we set for ourselves, if we want to make democratic global governance something other than an oxymoron, then we cannot wait for someone else to do it for us. We have to begin ourselves. Lastly then, how can we think that doing something ourselves will make a difference? Well, here I mention what I see as one of the greatest sources for optimism, which is the ever-increasing number throughout the world of bottom-up, grassroots, sustainable development networks that are working to achieve all the social, economic, and environmental dimensions of sustainable development. Even though many of the people participating in many of these networks have never even heard of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. These are self-starting, generally voluntary, self-governing, volunteer groups all over the planet. I'm sure there are many within just a few miles of here. Some of them are trying to clean up poisoned water. Some of them are trying to educate disadvantaged kids. Some of them are trying to make certain that we strike as communities against air pollution and carbon emissions. They're working in 1,000 different ways. Each and every one of them is an example of a new kind of democratic participation. And the hundreds of thousands of people who are active in these types of endeavors worldwide can be the genesis of the kinds of changes that I believe we must seek. We have very little time, though. So we need to begin seeking these changes now. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to entertain your questions. You may have a few. Anna has a little handout about my forthcoming book, in case you'd like to have one.
All right, thank you very much. And I think there will be a lot of questions and a lot of challenges on your ideas. So if any of you, I saw you typing questions.
Oh yeah, I did type questions.
Let me say this about the book. I'm told that mine is the first book that discusses in any detail the relationship between democracy and sustainable development. I'm also told that although there have been any number of books on democratic global governance and the need for it, mine is the first book that's actually set out a specific proposal for what we should construct to make democratic global governance. What I've made are suggestions, they're proposals. If anyone in the world has a better idea, then I'm all for it. Go ahead.
Well, your suggestions or proposals are certainly fascinating. But I wondered what makes you so sure that trust is the thing that's lacking, or rather that what you described as this network of unifying principles, the goal of sustainable development, is actually shared by enough people rather than economic progress in the short term. Because I've gotten a little bit cynical lately about the about my positive outset on the human condition.
If you haven't read it already, you should read Arendt's book, The Human Condition. It's one of the best books on political theory ever written. Nice phrase. Well, here's something from my own experience. I'm involved in any number of these volunteer networks worldwide. One of them is my own in East Central Florida in the United States. And when we began our effort, which is a volunteer effort involving many people in 8 counties, we're talking about an area with a combined population of nearly 5 million people. We convened a lot of local volunteers working on all different kinds of areas of local and regional concern. And the first thing we did was have a goal-setting exercise. What are our goals? But we didn't start with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Some of us were aware of them, I certainly was. Others were too. But in Florida, there's a reluctance to heed automatically the calls that come from the United Nations. There's a bit of distrust. So we didn't start with the SDGs. Instead, we started with a whiteboard and set out our own goals. We spent several sessions doing this and came up with our own goals. And guess what? They were basically the same as the Sustainable Development Goals. So what do people all over the world want? Despite their differences in how they approach their own governance, it must be noted that every member of the United Nations agreed on these goals. They papered over their differences to an extent, and they did not set out any specific ways for achieving them. they set out quite a few targets, but they didn't say, here are the goals and here is how we plan to achieve them. That's left to the individual countries. Otherwise, they would never have gotten a consensus. But they shared the same goals. And I think, for example, with the first goal, ending poverty. Who's in favor of not ending poverty? Now, we can differ on how we end poverty. Do we do it through communism, through socialism, through employment of the market? How do we do it? But the goal is the same. And I think this is true of most of the goals. I think they are a good reflection of what, on the whole, people in the world would want if they were asked to spend some time and sit down and list the kinds of things that were needed. There's also this. It's not the case that the goals are only future goals. The goals are also for now. It doesn't say to end poverty 20 years from now. It says end poverty. And we were making good progress toward that until the pandemic, when unfortunately the numbers went down and we ran off in the other direction. Now we're coming back a little bit. So the SDGs are an agenda for 2030, but that doesn't mean we have to wait until 2030 to achieve these goals. Sadly, we're falling behind in achieving them by 2030, which is one reason why I think we need to go in a different direction. Now, why do I think the issue comes down to a lack of trust? It's because of my own combination of experience and expertise in democratic governance and in governance at every level. It's hard to explain to people that they should be supporting changes in society that will affect them if they don't trust you. When I was in Congress, the most important thing for me was not having an electorate that would necessarily agree with me on everything, because I did not have that, nor will any representative. The most important thing to me was in having the trust of the people by being worthy of that trust. And because I had the trust of the people, I was able to say to them, this is how we need to change. This is what we need to do. And as it stands in the world now, we don't have that kind of trust. We don't have it in my country, to be sure.
Neither do we here.
Who next? Yes, sir.
So first of all, thank you very much for expressing those ideas and presenting them to us. That would
Well,
definitely
the book's
make me...
550 pages long, so there are a few more thoughts in there.
I guess I'll wait for spring 2025. So yeah, that will definitely make me think about the next few days, I think. But I have one question about responsibility, or holding people responsible for their action. Do you plan on any option to hold people responsible for their action within those randomly chosen groups, or do you think that's wholly unnecessary?
Let me go into a little more detail. Let's say that you're in Uganda and you have volunteered to have your name placed in a sample pool to be selected for one of these circles of participation for one of these institutions. And you got selected. What will happen? I envisage a period of 2 years the first 9 months would be a preparation period. In which you would have the opportunity to ask for any information you might feel you need to be better informed. When you ask for that information, it would be provided by an independent group of public servants who would participate in no way in decision-making, and who would not provide proposals or options for you, but would rather provide you with information when and if requested. At that same time, that same information would go to each of the 150 other members who have been chosen randomly for that same participation circle. And it would furthermore be put online so that everyone in the world could see that information. What if you can't afford to participate? I would do what Pericles did in ancient Athens with the participants who were randomly selected to serve in the jury courts. I would pay those people who were randomly selected for a period of 2 years at some reasonable amount. I would also require that their employers, from wherever they may be, would be required to keep their job open until they returned 2 years later. This is done in the United States for those who serve in the military reserve. If you're called up to active duty, federal law requires that your employer keep your job open until you get back. I would do that here, and I would do it worldwide. I would provide child care and other types of attendance services to make certain that whoever is chosen randomly to serve in one of these participation circles would be free to focus the entirety of their attention, to the extent that they choose, on the job of participation. So that's the first 9 months. And you could do certain things online here. You could listen to expert testimony online. I would, by the way, have circles of experts who would be chosen by each of the institutions for these purposes, reminiscent of the process that's used to pick the climate experts who serve the climate COP on the IPCC. But again, these experts would provide advice when requested, and they will participate in no way in decision-making. It would be left to those who are selected randomly to decide the value of their advice. The society in which we live, the future we seek, demands that we adhere to science and that we be responsive to scientific advice, but I don't think that the decisions about artificial intelligence or other types of advanced science and technology should be made by the scientists. They should be made by the people as a whole, democratically. The members of these circles would serve for a year, and then there would be a 3-month period afterwards. And here I come to your question about accountability. First of all, there would be a code of ethics that each person would sign. It would require full financial disclosure of all their net worth, their assets, their interests. There would be no lobbying whatsoever. Lobbying by any interest would be prohibited. And there would be an accountability at the end. This was done in Athens. Once you served in one of these magistrate boards, for example, there was a period in which you were required to submit to a process. For example, if you were charged with the use of funds and the spending of funds, you would have to account for how they were used and spent. It will be the same here. There will be an accountability process at the end. There will be stiff penalties if you had not fulfilled the ethical code. There's another point, although for reasons of expediency and the conveyance of information and perhaps for other purposes, especially since we're dealing with people from all over the world, I would do some things online, but the actual decision-making work of the circles of participation, all of them, will be done face-to-face. So you would have a group of people totaling 151, men and women, randomly selected from throughout the world. And because they're randomly selected, representative of the diversity of the world, sitting and deliberating and making a decision. And then how they did that in any given circle would be up to them. They might pick one of their own to be a moderator. We might have an expert circle of moderators from whom they could choose one who would moderate but not advocate. They might have no moderator at all and merely take turns speaking. It will be up to them. And then, as I said, they would make a decision. In order to avoid the problems that we have in the WTO that we've discussed earlier this week with the veto of a consensus by any one participating country, I would not have a rule that required census before taking an action. I would have a rule that required, mandated a vote if there was no consensus. If there's a consensus, fine. But if there's not, there would have to be a vote. Recall yesterday the situation we discussed where under the WTO treaty, you can vote, but everyone feels peer pressured not to call for a vote because there's never been a vote. I would vote, and the majority would prevail. And not an extraordinary majority either, a majority. And then, as I said, that would be the decision of the circle of participation. There would also be a decision taken by the traditional decision-making body of that institution, in the case of the UN, the General Assembly, and you would need an affirmative vote by both in order to take a particular action. Dual approval. Yes, sir.
So when you started talking about direct democracy in ancient Athens, I had an instant thought about Switzerland, which is used as a prime example in discussions here on direct democracy, because, well...
I think Switzerland comes closer than anyone else.
So they have referendums every 3 to 4 months. The government is shared by all factions and parties there. And there's also, I don't know if you know this, a thing called Landsgemeinde, where in 2 states it exists, where every voting person can join on a square. So there is an assembly of like 10,000, 20,000 people gathering and voting on matters brought in by the locals. but still the participation rates, the turnouts on the referendums, on the elections, on the so-called Landsgemeinde or like counties community, the participation rates are still quite low, so about 30 to 50%, even though you have that many ways of participation there in democracy. So, and there's furthermore a lot of distrust still in Switzerland, even through these possibilities. So, what's your opinion on that? That there are ways of participations. Also in Germany, there are elections that many people just don't care about. So, for example, social elections where we vote for a council on social security, but the turnout is about 10%, I think. So the people just don't care about that. So what's your opinion on just people not caring about what to deal on in politics?
This is the difference between universal participation and a universal opportunity to participate equally. What I'm proposing is the latter. What I propose is that in all of these sortition endeavors, those in the sample pool be volunteers. It's in part to address this type of issue. We really wouldn't want to pick someone randomly to participate in governance if they have no interest in participating, much less in governing, if they're content to have other people do it for them. But I think it is vital that everyone have an equal opportunity to participate. Thus, as I said earlier, what I propose is having sample pools comprised of those who volunteer to participate in a setting in which everyone knows that they do have this equal opportunity to participate if they choose to do so. Thus, the sample pools will only produce people who want to take part. And the size of the pools will be sufficient that even though they're comprised simply of volunteers, it will nevertheless be representative of the population as a whole. There's no empirical study of this, but no doubt it will be skewed a little bit toward people who are more civic-minded everywhere in the world, toward people who have a bit more education, perhaps, people who have, some type of stake in society or in the future. I don't know that this is a bad thing, and I don't think it will be skewed all that much if you're talking about sample pools with millions of people. But I think that would counter the tendency that you described. Why is this happening in Switzerland, which has so much true democracy built into its system? I would suggest that one of the reasons is that people may take it for granted. It seems to me that if someone tried to take this away from the Swiss, then the Swiss would be a force to reckon with. So, yes, sir.
So I have two questions. Could it be that one of the reasons why people, especially the working class, have lost faith in democracy is that in some countries, democratically elected officials who refuse to work for the interest of the United States have been...
You say it rather than reading it, and that way I'll understand what you're saying.
Okay. So in some countries, the democratically elected officials removed by the US intervention throughout the history. So is that made that one of the reasons that the people, the working class, have lost faith in democracy and democratic elections, especially in Latin America?
Well, it's certainly true that in Latin America, the United States intervened for a long time and many times in non-democratic ways. And I don't offer any excuse for that as an American. It should not have been done. But I don't know that the distrust of democracy in Latin America can be blamed on the United States of America. There are plenty of Latin Americans on their own without American help who've failed as leaders in democratically leading their people. I can name a few, but we'll pause rather than do that. What's your next question?
Do you think that a new system of international organization representing all humanity in a way that you described could function without the pressure and corruption of elites and transnational corporations?
Well, I would insist on that. As I said, I don't think there should be any lobbying. I think there should be strong ethical rules. I think there should be consequences if someone breaks those rules. You know, human beings are all alike. We're all subject to different kinds of temptation, among them financial. What you do is you put real guardrails in place to keep that from happening. I don't think international corporations should have any say in this whatsoever. I don't think interest groups of any kind, whether they be well-intentioned NGOs or the most nefarious of evildoers, should be allowed to lobby these randomly chosen participants to try to affect their deliberations and their decision-making. By the way, I feel the same thing about the delegates themselves and the other half of these institutions. Part of right representation is eliminating that type of pernicious influence. I talk about this in the book. Anna?
Yeah. Well, first, I was and I'm still impressed by your optimism. I love it. I have a question, yeah.
I'm not easily dissuaded.
That's really good. So I do believe, as you said it, that with participation people can restore their trust, because if you're part of the making, if you're part of the process, you can trust it more. But the people who will be then in the volunteering sample and will be elected, those I think will have trust in the process, in the making, and in the democracy. But I wonder about the rest of the people who might not even volunteer. If they volunteer, they're not being elected. And there's just like a little quote, little rest of just representative democracy. Are they will restore their trust?
Well, in terms of the broader populace, those who don't choose to participate, what are they looking for? They're looking for positive results. What will make them trust this new approach to governance? Positive results. If this reformed kind of democracy, this more widespread global democracy, produces decisions about the things that truly matter in ways that produce outcomes that improve the lot and the life of people throughout the world, then that will restore trust. And as I said, I don't see any other way both to restore trust in democracy and to achieve sustainable development, which, again, I think depend each on the other. Go back over here. Let me pick someone who hasn't asked. Yes?
I was wondering how would that system ensure that other democratic...
I cannot hear you. If you'll speak a little louder, please.
Yes, of course. I was wondering how that system could ensure that other democratic ideas than just that the will of the majority is seen through, but also mechanisms like the protection of minorities how that could be seen through in this system or ensured.
Well, here you're talking about, basic human rights and guarantees. And what do we have now? What we have now is a system that in different countries either protects the minorities or does not. As I discuss in the book, it's important that we maintain the basic principles of liberal democracy. We must have the rule of law. We must protect minority rights. We must have the right to remove our leaders when they don't serve us. And keep in mind, these circles of participation would serve for 1 year. People, it's a 1-year term. And if you didn't live up to the ethical rules, you could be removed during that 1 year. Also, I think that because they are representative of the population as a whole, these circles of participation chosen by random selection will themselves be reflective of the people as a whole and representative of the people as a whole, and thus will include minorities of all kinds. So rather than sitting and hoping, if you're a minority, that the government will protect you, you will be a part of governance, or at least you will know that someone like you is. Does this answer your question?
It does. I was just thinking that because they are minorities, they would probably also still not have a majority say in those reflecting circles that would create the policies.
Well, I don't believe in minority rule, do you? I believe in majority rule. I think what's important is to have majority rule and minority rights protected by majorities who rule. I would assume that we would all be respecting human rights because of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And certainly that provides for the protection of minority rights. I was asked a question by a student at the University of Sussex a couple of weeks. It's similar. And I have been talking about the need to take all the different kinds of people in the world who are invisible and make them visible, in part by seeing them and their real needs, and in part by engaging them and participating in the system. And her view was that those who've been on the periphery of the system, those who've been marginalized by it, should be now in charge. They should be given the right to rule because they've been discriminated against in the past. I don't agree with that. I think we are all equal in human dignity, and therefore we all have an equal claim to sharing and making the decisions that affect us. This includes minorities, but it also includes people who might be in the majority. Also, in my own experience, you may be in the majority one day and the minority the next on any particular issue. You're making a certain assumption, which is that people who are in some minority group may always disagree with people who are the majority. I don't know that that's an accurate assumption. It may sometimes be true, but I don't think it's always going to be true. At least it hasn't been in my experience. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm interested in what sounds a bit like a technicality, but it seems to be really important for your idea to work. So you spoke a lot about scientific sampling and how the groups you're choosing are representative of the whole populace. And you spoke about the Dunbar number, which separately makes a lot of sense to say, well, we have to have representative groups and we have to have a group that is small enough for people to know each other and work
The
together.
idea is to have something that's in that comfort zone between being too large and too small. Recall what I said about deliberation. And keep in mind, I've been in a deliberative body of 435 people. That's too large a body for people to actually deliberate. And indeed, it doesn't happen. And although I succeeded by making a point of knowing everyone in that body, not everyone does that. It's a lot easier when it's a smaller body. So you need a body that is going to be a representative sample, but also is not going to be so large that it can't deliberate. So I picked that number. You could pick one that's a little smaller or a little larger, and will probably produce similar results. So what's your technicality?
So yeah, it may take total sense about, well, how to be able to deliberate in this group, but it seems strange to me that when choosing out of hundreds, possibly hundreds of millions of people around the globe, 151 people should be representative for all those volunteers. So I know that you need to have this number, and let's say it's 170, 120, I don't care,
Well, again,
for it to work.
Again, as I say, and this is almost counterintuitive. It's like comparative advantage. The truth is the opposite of what you might think initially. You know, with scientific sampling, again, it's not the size of the population that matters. It's the size of the sample. The bigger the sample, the more representative the sample will be of a population of whatever size. The only way to make certain that the sample is exactly representative of the population size is to have the sample the same size as the population. So what you're dealing with in increasing the size of a sample for a population is an ever diminishing margin of error. Which means, as I said earlier, that a sample size of 150 is just as likely to be representative of a population of 1 billion as it is of 1 million. I know that's counterintuitive, but it is scientifically so. That's how we do all kinds of sampling all over the world for commercial and other purposes. It's long accepted, century or so. There are different kinds of ways to do it, but there are different kinds of sampling. Pick every 10th person, you know. But I proposed the simplest form, which is the most basic, but also the most likely to produce a representative sample because it has fewer steps. Is that helpful? Believe it or not, this size of a group will be reflective of the diversity of a large population. So, go ahead.
A very practical question. How do we implement such ideas when we operate primarily in countries where governance is based on a representative democracy? Is it purely a grassroots movement, or?
I think it has to be at the outset, because no government, even the best government, is going to volunteer to do this. And no institution is going to be allowed to do it internationally by the governments of which it's comprised. So what we do is we start without governance. We begin to construct it ourselves in different ways. For example, in Glasgow, COP26, there was the first ever Global Citizens Assembly. It was selected by sortition, not by the pure kind of sortition that I've suggested, but a form of random sample. And it did convene, and it did have people who were reflective of the diversity of the world, and it did make recommendations. And that group of people are planning on next doing the same thing, but in a larger way with a larger sample at the COP next year in Brazil. Meantime, there's nothing stopping ordinary people from constructing these circles, from devising ways to conduct their own random samples and convene these groups and begin to offer thoughts to these institutions coming from people who are interested in what these institutions do and not do. The more you do this, the more it will be done, the more credible that the proposals are, the more credibility these groups will have. I think there's great potential, as I discuss at some length in the book, in a lot of these volunteer grassroots efforts of sustainable development networks of all kinds worldwide. Many of them are starting themselves to link up and scale up worldwide. If you're interested in protecting sea turtles in Central Florida, then you join up with people who are interested in protecting sea turtles in Australia and sea turtles elsewhere, and you form a linked network worldwide. Indeed, this has happened. So there's a whole global network of people who are engaged in different ways in exchanging information and taking direct action locally to protect endangered sea turtles. And I'm in this network. But this is only one. There are hundreds of these. Millions of people worldwide are involved in them. You can comprise coalitions of these networks in certain sectors of human concern that may be the remit of a particular international institution. Environment, development, clean air, whatever it may be. Poverty reduction, water supply and safety, agriculture, whatever it may be. And these organizations can then, as a next step, begin to compose their own circles of participation that can advise, whether they want it or not, these international institutions. You might have a circle of participation relating to the issue of global hunger, and they could convene worldwide through a random sample themselves and then present themselves to the UN Food and Agricultural Organization and say, here we are. And what this can do is build an experience of sortition. It can build credibility for sortition. And as a practical political matter, it can create over time an appeal for sortition. The existing institutions can literally be surrounded. And then over time, these institutions can feel compelled, increasingly by public demand, to give some decision-making authority to these institutions. In other words, evolution, not revolution. I am a reformer, not a revolutionary.
If I could ask a follow-up question then. My other question is about the other half. So, okay, say this works, these institutions come together, they challenge existing institutions, their ways are better. Is this, in your view, something that is it forever, or is it just kind of bringing the race back to an earlier starting point? Like, what is to prevent people from saying, yeah, isn't representative democracy better because we did this and we do this for 50 years, and then at some point we say, yeah, well, there's some people who are really good at this and others who are not.
Well, as I said earlier, this is not a new idea, this idea of a participatory democracy. In a lot of the ways, I'm just following through on the ideas of John Dewey 100 years ago, although he never proposed global sortition. What he did propose is an active democracy in which people were truly engaged on an ongoing basis. I don't think the need for that is going to change in democracy. But then I don't think the democracies we have in many instances really are democracies, even those that tend to function as representative democracies. The United States of America, and this is not a commentary on our recent elections, even before the recent election, I would have argued is basically one kind of oligarchy competing against another one. Who next? Sir. I told you you needed to sit there because you would have a lot of questions.
Yeah, maybe I'm just a little confused. I was wondering.
That's been said about me.
You said, as we talked about practicality, that you would go around the existing institutions first, and then maybe they start replacing those.
Well, if they all want to take my advice and immediately do what I proposed, then I think that would be great, but I'm not expecting.
Yeah, well, I'm not either in the near future, but my question is, at one point you said that then, to take an action, you would need a yes, basically, from the existing old representative institutions and the new representative sampled circles.
In decision making.
Exactly. Wouldn't that create an additional barrier to action, thereby incentivizing inaction?
One could argue that, and you just did, but I think it might instead create a greater likelihood for actual action, meaning action that would lead to implementation, that would lead to something. Look at the climate agreement. We have all kinds of goals set out in the agreement, but none of them have been fulfilled. Why is that? Well, back home, no one trusts these climate negotiators. Everyone's afraid of what might happen if we engage in the kind of transformations they're talking about. And increasingly, politicians at the national level are reluctant to talk about these things. In my country, we had one candidate who was supposedly committed to more ambitious climate action, but she barely mentioned it in the last couple of months of her campaign. So I think you're more likely to end up with action in what I proposed than otherwise, even though it creates an additional element of decision making. I thought about that.
I suppose you did, that's why I asked.
That was my conclusion.
All right. With regard to the time, I think we just pinpointed it to the very end of the lecture. Thank you very much for these inspiring insights. And if I may say so, we talked about my field of expertise over lunch, and participatory democracy is one of them, and I'm probably gonna have to read your book to dive into your thoughts and maybe to challenge them. Maybe we have the chance to discuss that in the future. Really much look forward to that. So thanks for joining us. Thanks for these inspiring thoughts, and hope to have you here, not in 20 years, but as you said yesterday, much sooner than that. Thank you very much.
And I'd like to thank all of you, especially since most of you that I see have been here for all three of my lectures. It's quite a commitment of time on your part. I know you have busy schedules. I greatly appreciate it, and I trust you feel that your time has been well spent. I feel like my time has been well spent in being with all of you. Thank you again so very much.
Thank you.